The settlement of the Pacific was one of the last major human migration events in human history. It only occurred in the last few thousand years, but it involved incredible voyages across open ocean and vast distances, which means that those people had incredible technology and navigational skills that allowed them to cross these great distances very, very quickly, and at a time when in other parts of the world people were really hugging the coasts. The expansion of people into the remote Pacific, ultimately reaching Polynesia, is associated with the spread of Pacific languages, and in particular these languages belong to the oceanic subgroup of a family of languages called the Austronesian languages. And we can trace the homeland of the Austronesian languages to Taiwan, where the indigenous people of Taiwan speak the most diverse group of Austronesian languages, which allows us to determine that as the homeland. And so we can actually track the movement of people by looking at similarities in the languages and see those Austronesian languages spreading and changing, and then those new languages spreading across the Pacific. So people speak Austronesian languages all the way from Madagascar to the edge of the Polynesian Triangle, and that links those populations through their population history back to island Southeast Asia. In addition to being able to track the movement of people through the languages that they speak and identify those relationships, we can also see this archaeologically. So we see the appearance of new artifacts in the archaeological record. And archaeologically, the origins of the peoples of the Pacific can be traced to the Lapita cultural complex. And Lapita is defined by a combination of artifacts and settlement styles that we can see appearing in the archaeological record in the Bismarck Archipelago about 3,350 years ago. And it is the appearance of pottery, and in particular what we call dentate stamped pottery, and the design motifs that we see on that pottery that is probably the most identifiable characteristic of the Lapita culture, which spreads across as far as the edge of the Polynesian Triangle, Samoa and Tonga, reaching there about 2,900 years ago. So with these shared motifs that we see on the pottery, we refer to as dentate stamped designs. So the way that those designs are being made is that they're using little comb-like tools to put the decoration into the pot. And some people have suggested this is very much like tattooing, and the chisels that they use in traditional Pacific tattooing are very similar to the tools that we think they were using to make the designs on the pots. Some people have suggested that they're actually tattooing their pots. We also see similar motifs. A very common face motif is seen across the Lapita distribution in the Pacific, from the Bismarck Archipelago to the edge of the Polynesian Triangle. And we see those classic Pacific designs in tattoos today. The repetition of triangles, the repetition of kind of flower-like designs we see in tattoos today, we see in tapa cloth today, and so we see again a continuity between the ancient designs of the past of the Pacific ancestors and the designs that Pacific peoples are using today. So we can tell from the radiocarbon dates of archaeological sites in the Pacific, and those sites that are identified as Lapita sites, exactly when these people carrying this new culture appeared. So at about 3,350 years ago, Lapita sites appear in the Bismarck Archipelago, where people had already been living for about 40,000 years. And what we see is a melding of the culture there from a Southeast Asian aspects with the indigenous peoples and aspects of their culture, and then this new Lapita culture gets taken out into remote Oceania, where they're actually the first people to settle the islands. But what we actually see is this continuity of culture from the Bismarck Archipelago to the edge of the Polynesian Triangle, which indicates a very, very rapid process, only a few hundred years to get across thousands of kilometers of sea. And they maintain those contacts, and we can see that through the exchange, for example, of obsidian glass, which is an important tool for the Pacific peoples. So while the Lapita expansion traveled all the way to the edge of the Polynesian Triangle, to Samoa and Tonga, it did not continue into the rest of the Polynesian Triangle. We don't know why, but it wasn't for another 1,500 or maybe even 2,000 years before that final pulse into the Polynesian Triangle happened. First into Central East Polynesia, Society Islands and Cook Islands, and then up to Hawaii, out to Rapa Nui, and finally, about 750 years ago, down to Aotearoa, New Zealand. What we think was actually happening in terms of Pacific settlement was that there was a difference between voyages of exploration and voyages of colonization. So the explorers went out, probably canoes with men who were very skilled navigators who knew how to read the environment, to read the currents and the winds, to know what the signs, the natural signs were in the environment, from birds flying to cloud formations, and they knew how to navigate through the stars, that the rising and setting of stars. So these men would go out in a particular direction for a particular period of time, and while they were doing this, they were actually sailing into the wind, which is actually a much more difficult and time-consuming process. If they, in sailing for a particular period of time in a particular direction, did not find land, they could turn around and sail with the winds back to their homes, because the winds are always blowing from the east to the west. Then the next time they would go in a slightly different direction or slightly further, perhaps a few days further. And in this way, they systematically and safely scanned the Pacific, finding all of the islands. And we actually see this very rapid expansion in the archaeological record at the dates at which people reach these islands. So once the navigators found land, then they knew what resources were there, they knew what they needed to take with them. They would return home, pack up their colonists with their plants and their animals and their foods, and they knew how long the voyage would take and exactly where they were going. Then they would take their colonists on a colonizing voyage. So rather than being a particularly dangerous process where there was much loss of life, it was a safe process, a systematic process. And therefore that classic painting, that Goldie painting of starving people arriving on the shores of Aotearoa or the shores of any Pacific island, hoping that they got into a canoe, pushed off and had no idea of where they were going, and hoping that they would find land, but a lot of them would have died at sea. All of that carries with it, we think, is really now an inaccurate depiction of Pacific voyaging and settlement. When we look at the archaeological record in New Zealand, the earliest archaeological sites date to about 750 years ago, and we see sites dated to that period all around both the North Island and the South Island. And so people very quickly arrived in what we think was a mass migration. Multiple canoes, we're talking hundreds of people arriving almost simultaneously in Aotearoa, probably from multiple locations within Central East Polynesia, the Cooks and the Society Islands. They strategically settled. They figured out what resources were here, what stone resources, where they could grow their crops, and they established large settlements in very strategic places like the site of Warabar at the top of the South Island, and therefore they had access to both islands and both coasts of both islands. So it shows really the planning and the strategy and the skill of Pacific settlers thousands of years ago.